Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. In this video, we'll be looking at the most common surnames in the United States according to the 2010 Census, what the origins of the names are, and what those names mean. Before we begin with the list, just so that I'm not repeating myself throughout the video and so that you have some necessary background, I'd like to briefly explain how last names, or surnames, generally came to be. Almost all European family names, which is where almost all of the most common American surnames originate, have only 4 origins. The first category are patronyms. These come from taking the first name or given name of one's father, or even the master to whom they were apprenticed, as a surname. There are some matronyms where the mother's name was taken, but these are less common. Secondly are toponyms, taking the name of the place that one inhabits or a distinguishing feature of that land. Thirdly are occupational names, taking the name of the man's occupation, or sometimes even a side skill, as a surname. And fourth are epithets, also called bynames, which were nicknames that were given based on some other characteristic that ended up as surnames. These names generally started to become hereditary in Europe sometime in the latter half of the Middle Ages, although in some cultures this began much later. Because so many surnames were acquired so far back before there was a standardized spelling of the words, there are sometimes many different variations in spelling of the same names. These variations in spelling can be useful in identifying where the name comes from. This explanation alone does not help everyone because many people have names that have unclear meanings altogether. Most often, this is because it derives from another language or even an earlier form of English. Complicating this is the fact that non-English names sometimes had their spellings changed to make them easier to pronounce in English. Even when the name is a familiar word, however, it can be difficult to tell how it came to be. The same names, even with the same spelling, can have a wide variety of different origins. Not all non-English speakers kept their non-English names, however. In the United States, many of their names were anglicized, meaning Englishified. This involved translating the word into the English equivalent, or even just finding an English name that sounded similar, even if it had nothing to do with the original meaning. Finally, individuals from groups which did not typically have surnames often simply assumed ones that seemed practical when faced with the obligation to. Native Americans sometimes assumed common English last names simply because they were common. African American slaves often took the names of their former masters upon liberation. So, with all this in mind, let's get to it. Starting off is the surname Harris. This is a patronymic surname. It is a shorter form of Harrison, which means son of Harry, Harry's son, Harry being a nickname for Henry. It is an English name dating to the Middle Ages. This shortened version is common in southern England and Wales especially. There were many anglicized equivalents though. For example, the name is also common among the Irish, sometimes as an anglicization of O'Harhada, but also because so many English moved to different parts of Ireland. White. This is another English name, very common for people with this name to have ancestry in Britain or Ireland, but it is also another name with many anglicized foreign equivalents. It is often a byname, often referring to someone's hair color or complexion. However, there are other origins of the name. For example, in some circumstances, it could be a toponymic name relating to areas which contained the word white. Thompson, another patronymic name, son of Tom or Thomas, another surname commonly coming from Britain and Ireland. But there is an equivalent common in Scandinavia. The reason there is a P in Thompson is that it's likely a sound that people inserted on their own anyway when going from the M to the S that makes it easier to pronounce. You also see this in names like Samson, son of Sam, and Simpson, son of Sim or Simon. It eventually became so common that it was included in the actual spelling. The name Thompson, without the P, is typically a Scottish name. Perez, or Perez. This is usually a Spanish name. In the US, carriers of the name often have ancestry in Latin America. It is a patronymic name, suggested by the suffix EZ. Pero is a nickname for Pedro. The name thus means son of Pedro, I suppose the Spanish equivalent of Peterson. Lee. Lee has numerous different independent origins, many from England and Ireland. A common origin is the Anglo-Saxon Lea, meaning something like field or meadow. Many Lees likely had ancestors who lived by meadows or places that had the word in them. As a side fact, it's also hidden in many names. Kimberly, for example, which was originally only a last name. In Ireland, of numerous different possible origins, Lee may be an anglicized form of Oleg, descendant or grandchild of Leach, likely itself a name derived from an occupation. probably meaning the poet. It could also be Norwegian, from Li, referring to a mountain or slope. There is also the Chinese Li, also romanized as Li. This is one of the most common surnames not only in China, but other countries in East Asia as well, such as the Koreas, to which it spread. It comes from Da Li, meaning great judge, the office held by the legendary Chinese figure Gao Yao under the legendary Emperor Shun. However, the Chinese character from which the name comes changed at some point to mean plum, which is also Li in Chinese. Martin, a very widespread name across Europe. The name itself originally came from the Romans as something related to their god of war, Mars. This doesn't suggest Roman ancestry though, despite how common that must be. The name was popularized as a given name by the 4th century Saint Martin of Tours. Likely, it became a surname as a patronymic name when people had fathers named after the saint, or from places named after the saint. There are circumstances where it may have other origins though. For example, it may also sometimes have derived from Mare Town, town by a lake or the sea. Jackson, commonly a name from Britain and Ireland, son of Jack. Jack was usually a nickname for John, the word itself likely deriving from the French name Jacques, the actual English equivalent of which is Jacob or James. Moor, another name with many different possible origins. Commonly, this is an English place name, suggesting an ancestor who lived by a moor, or open, marshy land. It may also have a few Celtic origins, such as from the Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic, muir, meaning sea, or it may relate to various words in Celtic languages for great or large, in both a literal and metaphorical sense. There is also a Norman origin that made its way into England after the 11th century conquest, coming from Dolamar, of the sea. This can also have come from a nickname for someone with darker skin, relating to the Moors of North Africa. This wouldn't necessarily denote North African ancestry. For example, Ludovico Sforza, who was not from North Africa but northern Italy, but who had relatively dark skin and black hair, was referred to as Il Moro. Tailors probably have at least one ancestor who was a tailor, someone who worked with clothing. It is an English name primarily which arrived with the Normans, but it was also common for people who had equivalent names, like Schneider in German or Szabo in Hungarian, which also meant tailor, to adopt the English form when immigrating. Occupational names were reinforced as surnames because of how often the sons inherited the father's trade. Thomas, in its standard form, is likely a name coming from Britain or Ireland, but there are many equivalents all across Europe that were anglicized. The name itself became popular because of its biblical origins and developed into a surname for essentially the same reasons we mentioned with Thompson. This was likely often a patronym. Anderson, another patronym, the son of Andrew. This form developed in Britain, Scotland, and northern England specifically. Saint Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland, in fact. It is not always from Britain, though. When Anderson is spelled with 2 S's, or when son is instead spelled S-E-N, it would suggest Scandinavian origin. In fact, it is one of the most common surnames in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, with many immigrants from these countries changing their surnames slightly to the English spelling. Wilson. Perhaps you can guess where this is going to go. A patronym, Will's or William's son, common in England and Scotland, dating to the 14th and 15th centuries. William was, of course, one of 4 given names allowed for men in the Middle Ages. I'm joking, but it was a very, very common given name. Gonzalez, a Spanish name. Like many Spanish names in the US, it often comes from those with ancestry not just from Spain, but the Spanish-speaking Americas and Philippines. Once again, we see EZ, suggesting son of. Gonzalo was a given name originating with the Visigothic name Guntholf, meaning battle elf or battle soul. The Visigoths were the Germanic barbarians that took over the area of Spain and Portugal after the fall of Rome. Lopez, another Spanish patronymic name, it means son of Lope. Lope was a given name derived from the Latin word for wolf, lupus. Hernandez, or Hernandez, Spanish, son of Hernando, one of the Spanish equivalents of Ferdinand. It first arose in Spain in the 15th century. The name could also be Southern Italian, however, which was an area ruled by the Spanish for quite some time. Martinez, the son of Martin, the Spanish equivalent of Martin, which we have already talked about. Rodriguez, the son of Rodrigo. Rodrigo being the Spanish equivalent of the name Roderick, meaning roughly glory and ruler, brought to Iberia by the Visigoths. As a small technicality to correct myself from past videos, Roderick meant glory and ruler, not necessarily glorious ruler. It was what's called a dithematic name, which was a name combining two unrelated words, common with Germanic names. Anyway, Davis, the son of Davies or David, a common surname in England and Wales. Saint David is the patron saint of Wales, in fact. Miller. The main origins of this name lie in it being an occupational name, coming especially from Britain and Ireland. A miller was someone who operated a flour mill, grinding grain to make flour. Bear in mind, there are many foreign language equivalents of this name that were anglicized. Some of the most common in the US are Muller and Müller, both from German. Garcia. This is another name most commonly coming from Spain originally. Garcia was a very common given name in the Spanish Middle Ages, although its origins are actually somewhat mysterious. The best guess seems to be that the name is Basque in origin, from hearts, the Basque word for bear. Jones. This surname typically comes from southern England and especially Wales. It is a patronymic name, a Welsh version of Johnson, first recorded in 1273. Brown. Another common epithet, mainly coming from Britain and Ireland. It typically referred to someone having brown hair, complexion, or even people who often wore brown. Oft anglicized equivalents include the German Braun, Italian Bruno, and Don in Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic. William, the third most common surname in the US, has much the same meaning as Wilson, an English patronymic name coming from the Middle Ages. Johnson, the second most common American surname, also a simple origin, which we have already discussed for the most part, the son of John, a very common given name in the Middle Ages in England, with many foreign equivalents, like the German and Scandinavian Johansson or Johansson. And the most common American surname, which may not come as a surprise, with almost 2.5 million Americans having this name, is Smith. This was an occupational name for a smith or a blacksmith, someone who worked with metals. It generally comes from Britain and Ireland, but, as you might expect by now, many other countries had equivalents. Schmidt in German, Gowan, seen in McGowan, son of the smith, in Irish and Scottish Gaelic, Kowal in Polish, Kowalski being son of the smith, Lefebvre in French, etc. So why is this not only America's most common surname, but so common across many other countries? Was everybody a blacksmith? No. It was an essential trade found across Europe and well beyond, and certainly not rare, but generally speaking, it was a more difficult job that required special training, which made it a less common and more distinguished profession with which someone would have been more likely to identify, as opposed to something like a farmer. A village might have had several farmers named William, and therefore other names would have been necessary to distinguish them, but it was much more likely for there to be only one blacksmith named William. I hope. Well, by golly, I don't remember what I'm supposed to say. Well, I hope you liked this video. If so, please make your final selections and proceed to the front where a cashier will be happy to assist you. Thank you for shopping at Fire of Learning, and our mascot, Peanut the Capybara, wants to wish you a wonderful day.